Hi everyone, my name is Marilyn Quintana. I'm a regulated Canadian immigration consultant and I'm here today to talk about English test, the English levels, and some tips for you to improve your English studies. So let's start. But before anything else, as I usually ask you guys, please subscribe to our video, give us a thumbs up, and also leave your comment below so we can have an ideas on how to produce more videos for you every week. And don't forget to click on the little bell right below as well. So if you watched our previous videos, you know that English skills is one of the most important skills to have in order to get amazing points into the express entry system and be able to immigrate to Canada before coming to visit or study or work. So coming straight to Canada as a permanent resident. And in this video, I'll explain a little bit how you can find out your level and some tips for you to improve your studies. So let's start. In Canada, we use a level system called Canadian Benchmark Level, or CELPIP. So all the tests that are accepted, IELTS and CELPIP, they have a reference of the score that you get versus the CLB level that it corresponds to, okay? In order for you to be eligible to create a profile, you have to have the minimum of CLB 7 for Express Entry Federal Skilled Worker, CLB 5 for Express Entry Federal Skilled Trade Worker, and CLB 5 or 7 for the Canadian Experience class. However, as we are focusing on the people that intends to apply from outside Canada, let's talk about the CLB 7 forward, okay? When we say CLB, most people get confused because the most common leveling system for language skills used around all over the world, it is actually the CEFR, okay? So usually when you go to school and go to study English, your book is going to be most likely aligned with the CEFR level. The CEFR level are basically A1, A2 as the basic level, B1 and B2 as the intermediate level, and C1 and C2 as the advanced level, being the C2 the most advanced one, is the fluent level, okay? Okay, so in Canada, when you say the basic levels, we are saying from 4, the most common, to 5 are the basic levels. The pre-intermediate level would be the level 6. The intermediate level would be the CLB 7, 8, being the 8, the upper intermediate. And the advanced level would be 9 or 10, okay? So just for you to have an reference and understand what's the level comparing to the CEFR level, okay? And the score that you need to have in order to achieve good points for your Express Entry profile, it is the CLB 9 or CLB 10. I would say the most common CLB 9, and usually is sufficient according to the combination of the other skills that you have to have good points into the immigration program, okay? Now that you know how it works, you know that you have to be C1 at least in order to be equivalent to CLB level 9 in Canada, okay? So let's talk about the 2 tests that are accepted in Canada. So in Canada, we have 2 tests that are accepted, the IELTS General Training and the CELPIP General Training as well, okay? For French, so the same CLB applies for French proficiency tests, and then Canada accepts TEF and TCF as the tests that are accepted for the Canadian immigration system. For French, however, if you want to combine English and French, you are okay if you get CLB 7, because actually Canada wants to increase the number of French speakers, and if you combine both languages, you can have bonus points that you definitely assist a lot in your overall points and most likely allow you to get invited to apply very soon. So have that in mind as well. But what's the CLB level for CELPIP test or IELTS test, for example? For CELPIP, it is actually very easy because the CELPIP test was created in Canada. Therefore, already aligned with the CLB. Which means if you get the score 9 on CELPIP, you get the CLB 9. If you get the score 10 on CELPIP, you have the CLB level 10. One thing that's important to say, and you notice on the CELPIP test, is that Canada does not consider for immigration the overall result. Canada considers the score for each ability individually, meaning you have to perform great, you have to have good scores in all the abilities: listening, reading, writing, and speaking, okay? So if you have 12, because CELPIP goes from 0 to 12, if you have 12, for example, in reading and listening, however, you have 7 in writing and speaking, it's still not good for your points, okay? So you have to be consistent and have all the scores CLB 9 or above. So for IELTS, IELTS is actually a British test, so there is a conversion table for us to know what's the score versus this correspondent CLB level that is considered here in Canada. So for example, for the CLB 9, you have to have, out of 9, 7 as your score in reading, speaking, and writing, and 8 in listening. So 7 reading, speaking, writing, and 8 in listening. And those scores, they correspond to the level 9. If you have, for example, 7 in all abilities, you actually have CLB 9 in reading, writing, and speaking, but for listening, your CLB is actually 7, okay? So remember, Canada does not consider the overall. You have to reach that score for each ability that you have tested, and that's what makes your points great, okay? So now that you understood what's CLB and what's your goal to achieve great points for immigration matters, let's talk about how you can achieve those scores. The first thing that you need to know is that studying English and studying the test are two different things. If you study English only per se, you may not be able to do the test or perform well in the test. Even like if we ask a native person, a person that was born and raised in Canada, to take the test, eventually they are going to not perform so well because the test is tricky and require time management skills and understanding of all the topics before you can actually perform well. So if you're considering applying for immigration, you gotta study for the test specifically, okay? Usually, I would recommend for you to start studying for the test after you are at least at B2 level, if we're considering the CEFR standards, or the, let's say, advanced course in your home country, because usually you have to be already in an upper intermediate or advanced level in order to perform well and be able to study the prep for the test. For IELTS, it is very important for you to know that the test is widely available all over the world in most big cities. So many countries have many different cities that you can take the test. However, CELPIP is only available in very, very few locations. For example, Canada for sure, but US, we have the test center in New York, we have in Dubai, we have Philippines, and every now and then there is a new test center for CELPIP opening. But if you want to do CELPIP, the most likely place for you to go and find a good availability of the test, it is Canada, okay? So before we go back to the subject of how to prepare for the test, let me say quickly about the differences of the two tests, okay? So in the old days, IELTS was only available in paper-based, right? So this was actually a bad thing because not everybody now writes a lot. Having to write a lot in a very limited period of time, for most people were becoming challenging, right? So even for me, that at the time I was in school some years ago, we were used to do essays by hand. Like I don't write on a daily basis as much as I used to do. And it is difficult. You are not as fast. You kind of have to eventually erase something, go back, and that makes a mess paper, right? And you don't have time for that. So Before, IELTS was a tricky test because of the paper format, okay? But last year was introduced a new format, which is the computer-based, okay? And that made the test amazing. IELTS is actually my favorite test. Why? Because I have on a computer base the writing, the reading, and the listening, but I still have the person to talk to when it comes to the speaking test, okay? Which in my opinion makes it easier than to talk into the computer. Of course, every person is different. Every person has to choose the test according to their own abilities. CELPIP, for example, has the 4 abilities on the computer, which is great as well. However, I do find more difficult when you have to do the speaking part in the computer, okay? For IELTS, for example, in my opinion, the listening part, it is the most difficult one in the test, and it is the first one to be tested, okay? Why it is difficult? Because usually they have different accents, okay? So Canadian accent is very clear. I do like the American accent as well. And although I do love a British accent, it is a little bit more difficult to understand all the times. And sometimes it's even worse. We have Irish accent or Australian accent that it is a little bit less common to hear, therefore becomes more difficult for us to understand. Of course, if you're Irish or Australian, then it'll be a piece of cake for you. Something that I really like about IELTS, it is that I think that they are very fair in correcting writing and speaking tests, okay? So reading and listening, it is on the computer, it is pre-made tasks, just have to find the answer. If you do the computer-based, you have the headset, so it is easier to understand the listening part. You can make notes to answer the questions. It is about training the test, right? Writing and speaking, I would say it is fair because I think they evaluate you as a not native speaker, okay? In my opinion, the CELPIP test, for example, it is very, very easy to perform well on the reading and the listening part. The listening usually only uses Canadian accent, which is very clear and very easy to understand. However, for the writing and for the speaking, I do think there's something wrong with the test. I think they are assessing you as you were a master's professor in English, and you have to have a very, very high standard. So if you need 7, for example, or if you need 8, it is possible. But achieving the CLB 9 in CELPIP, in writing and speaking, for example, in my opinion, I see that's very tricky, and they give it to very, very few people this score, okay? So if you compare both tests and considering that you have to have the CLB 9 in all abilities, not in only 1 or 2, in all abilities, I do recommend you considering IELTS, okay? I think it is easier. I recommend CELPIP when you don't need the highest score and when you really don't like to talk to people, okay? Because the speaking test, it is going to be on the computer as well, but on IELTS, it is going to be with a person, okay?